Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Karibu. I think now every conference delegate now knows that Karibu means welcome. So welcome to the discussion panel, the status quo of inclusive community development practice. I am Anastasia Matveyevskaya. I am one of the ICD European directors and co-founder of the nonprofit organization Inclusive Practices, based in Georgia and supporting more than 400 inclusive communities in 9 countries of the post-Soviet region. And I am more than happy today to facilitate this panel discussion. And first of all, I want to say a huge thank you to Dominique, Director of Community-Based Inclusive Development at CBM, for your great contribution to organizing this panel. Thank you very much, Dominique, really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And I just want to notify that our panel has a little more time than scheduled indicated. We have 90 minutes and we plan to finish at 2:15 p.m. Nairobi time. Let's begin with a brief introduction and a few words of welcome from our speakers. Please, just for 1 minute, and can we start with our conference chair, Daniel Muya, please. You're welcome.
This is a good afternoon from Nairobi, and let me take this opportunity to welcome you to this conference, virtual WCDC 2021. For some of you, I'm seeing you for the first time, so let me take the advantage of welcoming you. I know, of course, many of you have been following the conference since the start on the 21st, and then welcome you to this discussion session as we discuss the status quo of inclusive practices. It's a privilege to co-chair this session with Anastasia, a great champion of inclusive practices. Welcome on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Dominique, you're welcome.
Yeah, welcome everybody. I'm really glad to be on this panel today. My name is Dominique. I work for CBM, and I'm the director in CBM for community-based inclusive development. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Dominique. Welcome. Brian, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Brian Watermeyer. I'm a disability studies academic based at the University of Cape Town. Hello from Cape Town. At the IDEA Research Unit at UCT. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Priscilla, can you hear us? Are you with us? Please go.
Yes, I'm with you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this important event. So my name is Priscilla Geiser. I'm the program director at the Secretariat of the International Disability Alliance. We are an alliance of 14 members representing networks of organizations of persons with disabilities around the world. And so together with our members, that's over 1,100 organizations of persons with disabilities in 182 countries. So I'm stepping in today to replace our executive director, Vladimir Chuk, who was unable to make it, but I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be part of this panel. So thank you very much, Anastasia.
Thank you, Priscilla. We're happy to have you today with us. Thank you very much. Anna, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here with such an interesting, important people for the people with disabilities, because I'm a mom of an autistic boy of 20. I'm representing a partnership with Inclusive Practices, international organization from Armenia, have 10-year experience in supporting families for the developing of communities for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome. Moses, you're welcome. Please, just a few words from you.
Thank you, Anastasia. My name is Moses Kamau from Kenya. I work with the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, the Department of Social Protection, and specifically Disability Division, where we develop policies and legislations on disability matters in the country. I'm happy to be here too.
Thank you, Moses. Thank you very much. An important reason for our discussion today was the baseline study on aspects of disability inclusion in community-based inclusive development programs around the globe conducted by CBM and the University of Cape Town. Now, I want to give you the floor, Brian, and you're more than welcome with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Okay, my assistant Meredith is helping us. Maybe you could put up the first slide for me, Meredith. So, thank you. So I'm going to be saying just a few words about preliminary findings of our study, the baseline study of the efficacy of CBM's community-based inclusive development projects across 8 countries, which we've just performed. It's important to say, though, at the outset that these findings are preliminary. This is a longitudinal study. We're collecting data. We have collected data in 2021, and we'll be collecting another set of data in 2022, and then again in 2024. And the logic of the study is longitudinal. So we'll be looking at comparisons and changes over time, hopefully improvements as well. That's the main logic of the study. And so these findings are the first tranche of data. So they are preliminary, but I think that the trends that we see are still interesting and also, you know, as I will show you, I think quite hopeful in a lot of ways. Number 2. So to start off, I'm just going to say literally 2 or 3 things about what community-based inclusive development is. For those of you for whom it might be a relatively new idea. And so what CBID is a mode of doing development work which locates people with disabilities at the center of its thinking and of its operations, in a way which aims to support people with disabilities in understanding and exercising their rights more fully, supporting disabilities in gaining more control of their lives through decision-making, and to maximize participation of people with disabilities in the life of the community on all levels. This is based on a theoretical position, which believes that deliberately including marginalized peoples in one's strategy for community development has cascading benefits for the entire community. It combats poverty, builds community resilience, and develops an active and mobilizing conversation within the community about issues of access and equity more broadly, which are going to be beneficial to everybody. Obviously, CBM has been involved in CBID work for a very long time now, and operating CBID projects in 33 countries around the world. We focused on 8 countries, number 3. So moving on to the CBID baseline study. It was performed by myself and colleagues at the IDEA Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. IDEA stands for Including Disability in Education in Africa. We focus primarily on education, disability inclusion in education, but on disability development issues more broadly as well. And what we were asked to do by CBM was to undertake the study in 16 of their CBID projects across 8 countries around the world, 2 projects per country. Those countries were Cameroon, Ethiopia, Honduras, India, Pakistan, Rwanda, Togo, and Zimbabwe. Excuse me. And what we did was we collected quantitative survey data, which was digitally collected by means of a questionnaire, as well as performing one focus group discussion with people with disabilities and other important stakeholders from each project across the 8 countries. And what we tried to do with the quantitative and qualitative data was to measure a set of variables which reflect the ideals of community-based inclusive development and how much these are being achieved in these communities, and with the qualitative data to develop more understanding and insight, more depth-oriented understanding of what's behind those numbers, and what important stakeholders think about what's happening in these communities and what needs to happen. Two broad priority areas we covered in the questionnaire and the focus group discussions. The first broad priority area reflects the inclusivity of communities, how inclusive are communities broadly. And the second priority area is the inclusivity of services and other support systems. And they're both crucial to understanding how inclusive a community is. Number 4. So starting with priority area 1, inclusive communities. How inclusive are these communities more broadly? Within this priority area, there were 5 areas, 5 objectives of community-based inclusive development, which we assessed. Those were the following: self-confidence, the extent to which people with disabilities have self-confidence in the community, the quality of support received by these people in the community, the level to which people with disabilities participate in the community at all levels, the level at which people with disabilities get to participate in decision-making and fill leadership roles in the community, and finally, the level to which the community broadly understands and respects the rights of people with disabilities. Number 5. So in this first priority area, and I know this is a whistle-stop tour, I hope it's digestible. Here are just a couple of key findings. I say again, this is the first tranche of data of a longitudinal study, so it doesn't stand on its own as well as it will later when we have comparative data, but nevertheless, there are positive trends. Beginning with self-confidence. And what we found here was that self-confidence of people with disabilities varied a lot, but was broadly around the average range. But with only about 90% of people with disabilities falling into the category of clearly identifying themselves as having a positive sense of self-confidence. So that's quite low. And what was identified here is the need for better inclusion of people with disabilities in education and better access to sustainable livelihoods. This was connected sort of deliberately by stakeholders to the question of self-confidence in people with disabilities. Interestingly as well, added to that was the need for parent education and an emphasis on how people with disabilities are socialized first and foremost within the family. And so the question of self-confidence of people with disabilities depends to some extent on parents being educated about disability as a social justice issue. Moving on to quality of support, this was lower and largely below average across communities. Interesting here was that stakeholders emphasized that material support is paid a lot of attention to, and quite justifiably so, in terms of this issue of support within the community. But what they pointed out was that emotional support is often under-recognized, and the need for emotional support is underestimated, and that was emphasized. There was also a need identified here for communities to be educated more on disability as an equity issue and how this would improve levels of community support. In terms of the area of support, a point that was made again and again is that supporting families is a priority, and I think this confirms what we suspect very much as, in development work, that the family is a crucial vector providing support and empowerment to people with disabilities. So if we can provide what families need, we do a lot to moving towards a more empowered community of young people with disabilities and adults with disabilities. The sorts of supports which were named that families need are logistical and financial, but again, interestingly, also emotional support. And again, the idea that emotional support for families is something which is underestimated. Community participation is the next issue. And this was also variable, but very poor in some places, with people with disabilities describing experiences of being made to feel unwelcome at cultural and other community events, sometimes stigmatized, and leading to feelings of alienation from membership and a sense of belonging in the community. This was worsened by physical barriers to participation, such as relating to the built environment, and financial constraints, and those financial constraints often relate to having the money for transportation to be able to move to places where one can take part in cultural and other community events. In terms of representation of people with disabilities in leadership and decision-making roles, representation here very low. And what was pointed out here in the qualitative data was that internalized depression is also an under-recognized issue. The idea that people with disabilities, through their experiences of socialization, often experiences of discrimination in the home, in the family, in the school, places of work, can grow into lives where they carry self-limiting beliefs about their own potential, possibly, and also a lack of healthy entitlement to full participation and to fitting leadership roles and so on. The issue of internalized depression was regarded as, again, something under-recognized and important. In terms of stereotyping and discrimination, this was reported to be prevalent by about half of our respondents, but also very variable across countries and across projects. But there was some hope here in the sense that in a number of projects or a number of communities, the local community-based inclusive development project being pursued by CBM was clear, was sort of deliberately identified as a cause of improvement in this area, leading to lower levels of discrimination and stereotyping, and a noticeable improvement. And number 6. So that was priority area 1. This is priority area number 2 we examined. And this relates to accessibility of services and other social supports. The 5 areas we examined here, unsurprisingly perhaps, access to the following key resources: healthcare, education, sustainable livelihoods, transportation, and housing. Number 7, key findings in this area. So about 34% of the people with disabilities we surveyed reported that they were in good health, and about 54% reported that they received treatment, received healthcare services which were appropriate, helpful, and respectful. Of course, that means that about 46% did not receive appropriate, helpful, and respectful healthcare services. Barriers to accessible healthcare were identified as physical barriers related to the nature of the built environment, attitudinal barriers, often in healthcare providers, as well as financial barriers. And again, sometimes that speaks to the need to pay for services in some areas, but quite often it speaks to the issue of having enough money for transportation to actually get to the place where services are being dispensed. Quite hopefully, and I think this reflects very well, excuse me, on CBM, CBID projects in these communities, only about 19% of our respondents with disabilities said that they didn't have access to rehabilitation services that they needed. So most said they did have access to the rehabilitation services they needed, which reflects well on these development projects. But interestingly, and perhaps in a slightly contradictory way, only 38% of our respondents said that they had full access to all of the assistive devices that they need, and that those assistive devices were working well. So there's a gap there, and the need for more sort of smart distribution of assistive devices. In the domain of education, one area which was identified as a problem was a lack of teacher training. In other words, teachers not trained in specialized skills to promote access to the curriculum for learners with disabilities. This was seen as a cause of exclusion, and that exclusion was worsened by buildings which are inaccessible, and again, the ubiquitous issue of transportation and the problems with financial resources to gain transport to and from school, as well as just transport services which were accessible to learners with disabilities. Of course, we know that exclusion from education underpins an exclusion from participation in the economy, the possibility of sustainable livelihoods, this can lead to lives trapped in poverty for people with disabilities, and so the connection there is clear. In terms of access to transportation, I've said it a couple of times already, you know, we can't emphasize enough what a global and profound issue this is. And we saw how access to transport is an issue which sort of creeps into so many other issues of access and exclusion in the lives of people with disabilities in these communities. Of course, we know that transportation is essential in accessing important services like health, education, and so on. But we also found that that access to transportation also has implications for an experience of identity and of entitlement to full participation, because it is through transportation that one has the freedom of movement with which one can elaborate one's identity. And what I mean by that is going to places you want to go, associating with who you want to associate with, taking part in cultural events that you're interested in, following your interests, and through that elaborating your identity, and through that feeling like a full participant in the community. Transportation has implications for all of these things. Number 8. So that's a whistle-stop tour of a couple of key findings, just a few comments, a few general comments. The findings were mixed. We'll have more clarity after the collection of the second and third tranche data. But we do find that exclusion of various forms remains pervasive across these communities. And this reflects, we believe, a lack of knowledge about disability as a human rights and social justice issue in communities broadly, as well as sometimes in people with disabilities themselves. But as I've said, there were several hopeful signs, which I believe reflect the broad community benefits of doing development work which has a disability focus and which places people with disabilities at its center. We believe that this kind of work, what's come through in the discussions, is how a form of development work which places people with disabilities at the center and contributes to creating communities which are more caring, which are more mindful of difference, and communities which are more open to conversations about disability and inclusion involving a range of identities and people with a range of forms of disadvantage. And that can only be positive in terms of creating more cohesive and cooperative communities of individuals that support one another. Of course, and this speaks to the Sustainable Development Goal principle of leaving no one behind, which all this is about. Thanks. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Anastasia.
Thank you very much, Brian, for this presentation. I think that everything you have said is very important in terms of inclusive community development practice, and we really have a lot to discuss here. I just want to ask all our participants of our plenary, of our panel discussion, please feel free to use chat for your questions and comments. We will read all of them. So let's start from the first question. Priscilla, can we start with you, please? You represent the most global organization in the field of disability, International Disability Alliance. And I think that you, more than anyone else, have a vision a holistic vision of the situation of the status quo of inclusive community development. Please, can you share with us your opinion, your vision of status quo of inclusive community development now?
Thank you very much, Anastasia. So perhaps as a start to this conversation, I think it would be important to clarify what we mean exactly by inclusive community development. So I won't pretend to define what is development, but I would like to look a little bit more at what we mean by inclusive. When we say inclusive, it can be understood as participatory of the communities themselves, which is fine and it's needed, but I think it does not necessarily imply sufficient attention to overcoming the discriminations that exist in the concerned communities. So we know, we've spoken about the discrimination, the barriers that exist for persons with disabilities to be included in their communities. Thanks very much to CBM for putting together this panel and an opportunity to discuss it. And even though that varies from community to community, it may take different shapes and forms, but this is a universal observation that exclusion is pervasive. Adding to this, when we speak about inclusion, I think we have to bear in mind that persons with disabilities are not a homogeneous group. So among persons with disabilities themselves, certain groups are more discriminated than others, such as persons with intellectual disabilities, persons with psychosocial disabilities, persons with deafblindness. And if you add one more layer, people with disabilities may also face intersecting forms of discrimination. So being a woman and having a disability, being a person from an indigenous background, and so on and so forth. So in our view, when we talk about inclusive development or inclusive community development, we are talking about all. Yeah, all means all, and we need to consider the diversity. And I don't think that if we look at inclusive community development practices so far, we are far from this, unfortunately. The other key word is community, and again, that could be a thesis, so I won't be long. But I think when we think about community development, there are 2 points I would like to make. One is that to be something that we can act upon and influence, a particular dimension of the community is its political and administrative dimension. This is where we can identify with, again, enormous diversity across the world, the local authorities of a village, of a district, a barangay, a shura, whatever you name it, with a mandate and clear prerogatives. And these are interlocutors that are identifiable, they can be influenced, and they can bring direct and tangible results at the level of community. So we know that inclusion of persons with disabilities doesn't come naturally on the agenda of decision makers. So for community development to be inclusive and really grounded in human rights, it requires this dialogue with local authorities. So we need solutions at the system level so that people with disabilities rights are not dependent on whether or not there is a CBID project in their region. And community, I think that's my second point, and I'll stop there, also has a particular resonance for persons with disabilities, because in many contexts, persons with disabilities are still living in institutions that seclude them from their families and communities. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has a dedicated article on living and being included in the community. And one of the key considerations when we speak about inclusive community development is really to ensure access to support services that enable people to live in the community rather than in institutions. So by that, I mean forms of assistance and products, and Brian has spoken about some of them, that help persons with disabilities to carry out their daily lives activities, participate in their communities. You spoke about assistive device, but there's also sign language interpretation, assisted housing, personal assistance, etc. So I think when we speak about inclusive community development and the state of play, the status quo, there's increasing attention to the care economy and related gender equalities, but often it doesn't include a disability rights perspective. And there's a growing risk in certain contexts that the lack of support services at the community level pushes for the creation of institutions. So there are different models coexisting, but I think these are key consideration, dialogue with local authorities to create sustainable solutions, and being inclusive of all that are really important messages to have in mind. Back to you, Anastasia.
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you for clarifying these important issues. I think we have really to be very clear in terms and understanding the content, terms and content. Moses, can I ask you the same question? What is the vision from your end? What do you think about the situation with inclusive community development? What is your vision? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Anastasia, and thank you for that presentation. I want to say that first, persons with disabilities, especially, in Kenya and maybe many parts of the world, they are discriminated. And, the issue of stigmatization is still very much alive in our communities. In some communities in Kenya and in Africa, some communities believe that having a person with a disability in the family is a bad omen. It is a bad luck. So that comes with a lot of stigmatization, where those families, sometimes they are forced even to hide those persons who are, or those children who are born with disabilities, and they will never be brought out, into the community. The family feels stigmatized because they have a child or a person with disability. So issues are many, and there's a close link between disability, and poverty, and that's why you'll find that most of persons with disabilities, they live in the informal settlements, in urban centers, or in the rural areas where poverty is a bit, the poverty index is a bit low. And because of that, most of them do not access education. Most of the persons with disability, they are not taken to schools, because maybe even some families believe it's not, it's not important to take such children to schools to gain education. And again, the schools that we have, the built environment is not conducive for persons with disability. It's not, they're not inclusive. The classes, the environment is not conducive for persons and children with disability. So because of that, many of them, they are not, they do not participate in the mainstream education. The inaccessible transport, as has been mentioned, in our country is not inclusive. The modes of public transport that we use, most of the time, in many cases, it's not inclusive. And persons with disabilities, they have a problem moving from one place to the other, going to school, going to work and all that, moving from one region to another. It's such a big challenge. Again, unconducive and an inaccessible environment. I'm talking about hotels, I'm talking about schools, hospitals. They're not accessible to persons with disabilities. And that makes them not to interact with the community, where, for example, the community engagement barazas, we call them barazas, or meetings, forums, they cannot be able to get there because maybe they don't have somebody to assist them. And those, when decisions are being made in the community, persons with disabilities are not there to represent, to present the issues. So most of them, they are left out. The issue of inadequate assistive and appropriate assistive devices, again, is a big issue, because most of these the assistive devices, they are either very expensive or not appropriate for the environment where persons with disabilities live. If it's even a simple, let's talk about a wheelchair. We don't have wheelchairs that are adapted for the rural environment where there are hills and muddy and all that. So that becomes a very big problem. Again, the issue of communication, channels that are used to communicate in the community. For example, when there is a program that is being rolled out, where you're bringing people together to deliberate on such a program, the channels that are used, they are not accessible to persons with disability. So most of them, most of the times, they are just left out. They don't know, they do not have even information that something is happening within the community. Again, as health services, we do not have, those specific services for persons with disabilities. So they compete with the rest of us when it comes to attaining or getting services in hospitals. So I think it is something that we may need to improve. And that is the status quo as far as I'm concerned in this country. And I hope that we shall be discussing this as we move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. Thank you for explaining these challenges. It's really important. And now let's have the vision from another part of the world. Anna, what is your view of the status quo in inclusive community development?
Yes. So regarding from the view to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and the post-Soviet region of Asian and Caucasus countries, the status quo is that from one side, of course, this process of developing of inclusive communities is very active. And if we say what was 5 or 10 years ago, it's really another picture, a great difference. And people are becoming more involved and interested. And people with disabilities, they are becoming more aware about their human rights, about their involvement in social life, and they are getting out of special institutions and trying to become a part of communities. And there are a lot of new formations of inclusive communities in all these countries, and they started to communicate with civil bodies, with educational organizations, with stakeholders. And this process is really very active, and people, how to say, their motivation is increasing in this process. I think that people are becoming more qualified. They understand what they do, and the communities, they are more flexible and open for now. But of course, we have very serious issues. First of all, it is an educational system. Inclusive education is a rule now for all that countries, but it's a not real practice, because I see, and I think it's a real problem, that this kind of education, it is not possible for integrating inclusive education. Like, this type of education doesn't give us opportunity to put inclusive kind of education. So it means that the whole educational point should be changed. Education system should become more open, should become not so conservative and flexible, or some kind of educational non-formal organizations, community forms should be created for the possibility to different people in diversity to educate in the same community and connect with each other. And labor market is also in the same situation. Like, what we see, that all the kind of jobs are don't have this wide variety when people can show their talents, their possibilities, though they have some kind of special needs. And it seems that this educational system and labor market, they try mostly to put everything on one level, very simple level, and this level cannot be open and flexible for this kind of people. And I think it is a real challenge now for these countries to understand what to do with education and what to do with labor market, to give job to these people, to understand what is community development process is within institutions which are not private, but which are also connected with government, with country rules and law. And the same problem we see what comes to the problem of institutions where people with disabilities were living for many, many years. Now there is a convention that gives them a right to get out of these institutions, from this isolation, special isolation, and become a part of community. But the thing is, they went out, but there are no communities which are capable to give them another kind of assistance. And this assistance, and families are not assisted as much as they need. Maybe they get some kind of money assistance, like financial assistance, but they don't have psychological assistance, they don't have educational assistance, and families need this education, this support, and the level of their understanding of how the situation is changed should be higher. And this is a work that should be done with communities and for communities. I think these are the main points that give problems, because what comes to medical support, to therapy support, in these questions, I think it's much more better than it was a few years ago. And the process of people involvement is much more active. So this is it.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. I know what a great job you are doing supporting families with disability in your region. Thank you. As I understand, Dominique, since the CBM was conducted this research together with University of Cape Town, so can I ask you to make like a general summary of this matter of status quo of inclusive community development?
Thank you, Anastasia. Yeah, well, I would like to take us back to a basic principle of inclusive community development, which is that we want to contribute to a society where no one is left behind. Yeah, and leaving 1 billion persons with disabilities out of the picture is simply not going to work. So to achieve inclusion in community development, I think we need to look at a careful interplay of the global level, but then the national level, the regional level, and the local level. And let me just reiterate that there is a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities that enshrines the rights of persons with disabilities at the global level. And like Priscilla pointed out, there is one article, Article 19, which addresses the right to live in the community with equal choices to anybody else and to be fully included and to fully participate in the community. So that is what we have at the global level. And that now, of course, needs to translate down into national, regional, local legislation and hopefully practice. Now, when it comes to community development, we have the obligation to meaningfully include persons with disabilities in all matters that concern them. And what we often do is we apply a twin track approach. And Moses has pointed at that, Anna has pointed at that one track of this approach is to make sure that specific services for persons with disabilities are available, including assistive devices, but then also that the other track is that mainstream services that are available to the entire community are also accessible to persons with disabilities. And what is usually applied, what we apply in CBM and many other organizations do, is to look at affordability, availability, at acceptance of services, and to look at the quality of services. So we really talk about A's and the Q. Are services affordable? Are they available? Are they accessible? Are they accepted by the community? And are they of good quality? So these are some basics I would like to mention when we look at the state of play of inclusive community development. And one thing that is very important is that including persons with disabilities in community development ultimately benefits the entire community. I think that's a very important message that we need to take with us. I can give you one practical example. If you have an accessible town hall or an accessible market, this will not only benefit a person in a wheelchair, but it will also benefit families with children, older persons in the community, and so forth. So coming back to your original question and what we've discussed, the state of play of inclusive community development, I think since 2006, when the UN Convention was adopted, we have taken first steps. And thank you, Anna, also for pointing at some of these in your region and programs. So progress has been made, and we have seen a tangible impact in many community programs. But I would say there is still a very, very long way to go. And Moses and Brian, you have hinted at that. I would say the crucial things we still see is that the painful reality is discrimination within families, discrimination within institutions like school or the place of work is still there in many, many places. And the pandemic has shown how vulnerable some of the progresses we have made and the achievements we have made really are. So in many places, we have seen a resurgence of exclusion and of discrimination of persons with disabilities in their communities. And that is really, really a major concern. So in general, Anastasia, I would say there is some light that we can see since 2006, some progress has been made, but it's very, very fragile. And there is still a very, very long way to go for all of us.
Thank you, Dominique, for this summary. Really, very, very long way to go. We have all been through a really challenging times of the pandemic, and we're still going through it. So let's talk about what negative and maybe some positive impact has the pandemic had on the status quo of inclusive community development. And I also ask our participants to share their opinions and maybe some examples with us through chat. Please, you're welcome. Brian, can I start with you? In terms of your research, what do you think about impact of the pandemic? I'm sorry, Brian, you're mute. Please turn on your microphone. Yeah, turn on. Not yet. Do you see the microphone button? Have a look. I see that our tech support team asked you to turn on your mic. Do you have the? No, not yet. Okay. Can I ask our technical support team to help Brian through chat? And Anna, maybe we will start then with very small organization to talk about this this field of problems, and then we'll go to global.
To the bigger.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that this negative and positive impact that pandemic have, they are very connected to each other, and we can say negative is positive and positive is also negative because they are very contradictional. Of course, it was a real psychological pressure on people, and this depression because people lost like a touch with the real life, and they lost the possibility to get assistance, sport assistance, therapy assistance, physical assistance. They lost this possibility to get in touch in real life with the people who were helping them. I mean, people with disabilities. And this, of course, was not a good effect for people with disabilities. In the post-Soviet countries, it took about 6, 7, 8 months after pandemic lockdown started to form some online formations methods to find a way to give this assistance online, for example, if it is possible. It took a long time. And this period, people were locked in houses. and for people with disability, more so even sometimes when, or like to say, simple people. But I think it gave a chance to everybody to have some inner look inside of themselves, to see their own values and own intentions and purposes of life and meaning of their life. And I think that we will see in future the positive effect of it, because many people made some re-evaluation of their life. And now, if somebody is really interested in community development and he wants to be there, he will stay there for his life because he decided it. He had the time to understand it. And people who said, okay, it's not my job, okay, they will make their decisions. And I think the situation will be more clear. We will understand who is going to do this and who is not. And I think it's a very positive effect. What comes to the second positive thing, people who are involved in disability development, community, inclusive community development, they are very hardworking people mostly, and they don't have time to be online. And they don't very common with this online stuff, you know, mostly in post-Soviet countries, people who are older than 45, they are not common with Zoom, online, Facebook, every kind of communication ways to do that. And this pandemic gave them an opportunity to understand how they can communicate internationally online in distance. For example, Inclusive Practices made 3 marathons of inclusive practices during 1 year of pandemic, and more than 50, 60, Anastasia, maybe more, I don't remember the right figures, but communities from different parts of the world saw each other. They shared their experience, they saw each other, they get acknowledged each other, they understood a diversity of activities, and they understood that they can have this communication, they can learn from each other. And I think it's a very good point. The pandemic gave this opportunity to these people, and this efficient readiness to distance working, distance cooperation and collaboration came out, and it's very good. I think that any people who are interested in community development of inclusion, they will find the way to get out of the boundaries. And it's very important to find new things that are not common, that are maybe never experienced, but to find them out, to discover them. And I think pandemic gave this possibility too.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much for sharing this opinion. Brian, we can hear you, I hope now.
Good.
Oh, great. You're with us. Yeah, you're welcome.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Yes, I mean, what we found is that it's been hard, you know, the pandemic with its limitations on movement and the disruption of logistics in all sorts of ways for communities has hit people with disabilities extremely hard. You know, for one thing, there's a situation where, because there's an international disaster and where, you know, communities are in a state of hyper awareness of all of the struggles that the pandemic presents, that means that issues and conversations around something like disability inclusion do become deprioritized and have become marginalized. You know, if there are difficulties with the logistics of transportation, accessibility of transportation because of the pandemic, for example, of course, that's going to hit communities that already live with a deprivation of access to those resources. It's gonna hit them harder. It's going to be more difficult for people with disabilities to stand in queues to get to where they need to be to overcome all of what the pandemic presents to us. Excuse me. On the positive side, though, I do want to pick up on what was just said about online connectivity and how you know, it's been a crash course for much of the world. The pandemic has presented a crash course in developing online communities, and in various contexts for a long time now, I've seen how powerful digital platforms are in education around disability and in creating cohesive and mobilized disability communities. And we have seen an uptick in that, and new resources being discovered, in terms of being able to connect up people who face similar challenges in terms of exclusion. I want to say another thing though, and that's that in a paradoxical way, I mean, perhaps I should start by saying this. Development studies is not my speciality. I'm a disability scholar. I speak as a psychologist and as a person with disability myself. So I'll leave the details of technical and strategic aspects of development to the experts on this panel. But I have been involved in some writing recently around the pandemic, where we've come to the idea of what is known as the invisible lockdown. And what that's about is, I'm interested as a psychologist in people in communities understanding one another's predicaments better than they do. And that's what potentially is so powerful about putting people with disabilities at the center of development work, is that we're developing a conversation which is about exclusion, and everybody experiences exclusion in one way or another. The idea of the invisible lockdown is to do with the fact that for many people with disabilities that we have collected data from and had conversations with, what the pandemic has presented, and particularly hard lockdowns have presented, are situations where the members of the broader community are subjected to limitations in terms of freedom of movement, freedom of association, which many people with disabilities experience on a day-to-day basis. For people with disabilities, this is normal life. And what they told us is, we've been part of this invisible lockdown for our entire lives, and it's interesting to us now that a situation has been created where other members of the community are beginning to experience some of that as well, and also interestingly seeing how members of the community, sometimes there's humor around this, respond in quite a petulant and an irritable way to the restrictions placed on them by the pandemic. And I've had conversations with people with disabilities who sort of roll their eyes and say, for us this is real life, this is normal life. That's wrong and a reflection of injustice. But the positive part of that for me is the potential there to create conversations of mutual identification around the experience of exclusion. And this is how we build communities that are more cohesive. If we can understand one another better. And what has been created here is a situation where members of the broader community are perhaps being subjected to just one small sliver of the experience of what it means to have, say, a severe physical impairment and living in the community in which they live. And there's potential there, I think, to build a conversation of mutual identification and to create more understanding, to create more of a sense of our human commonality in terms of all being vulnerable as human beings. The pandemic has shown that up for everybody. And these are the conversations I believe we need to develop, which show up vulnerability not as something which is peculiar to people with disabilities, but as something much more fundamental and which we have in common as human beings. And I think there's hope there for new connections to be made. Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you, Brian, for sharing with us your vision. Dominique, is there anything you would like to add or clarify about this very important really question?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would simply want to add that the pandemic has shown how vulnerable the situation of persons with disabilities in many communities really is, and has had a devastating impact on the rights of persons with disabilities in many communities. Anna mentioned systems have broken down, sometimes access to basic necessities were not there anymore, and to the pandemic were very exclusive very often Brian mentioned, is prioritizing persons with disabilities, which led to life-threatening situations in many, many cases. So that is the bleak picture, and I would say my bleak and very, very negative summary. However, Brian, I really appreciate that you're looking at light at the end of the tunnel, and also some positive aspects. I think many people around the world, like you said, have been able to relate to a situation of exclusion and isolation much more, because they have been going through their own lockdowns, and we've seen some positive practices also emerging in inclusive community programs during the pandemic. So for instance, often due to awareness raising of organized persons with disabilities, there was data collected about exclusion in the communities. There was a conversation with local governments, between organizations of persons with disabilities and local government. And finally, responses then were also adapted. And when I look at community development programs across the world, many of these programs were very agile and adjusted very quickly to become more exclusive and to fill gaps that they had seen, a number of which were already mentioned. One would be also supporting persons with disabilities to be able to remain active in political processes, even during the pandemic and during the special situation.
Thank you, Dominique. Nice to see you, Priscilla, now with your video. We are, my organization, Inclusive Practices, we are an active member of Inclusion International. And we see and have seen what huge resources have been used by global organizations to support communities, inclusive communities and people with disabilities in these challenging times. So can you share with us your vision, pandemic and the status quo of inclusive community development, positive or it sounds strange, of course, negative or maybe some positive impact. Please go ahead. Welcome. Can you switch on your mic, Priscilla? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling with the unmute button as well. So thank you very much. I think building on what has been said already, I think the pandemic, it really has had a disproportionate and that it is one of the strong message. I think it really acted as an amplifier of inequalities that pre-existed before the pandemic. And I think as we move ahead now, everyone is talking about building back better. We need to build back better, and that means more inclusively. And I think there can be also a temptation to revert to, to go back to what was before. But persons with disabilities were not included before. And I think the pandemic provides an opportunity to think how we can do things differently. Our observations as a leading network of organizations of persons with disabilities globally, the feedback we got from our members were really disconcerting. I mean, persons with disabilities were deprioritized in access to healthcare, so we had to advocate with the WHO against discriminatory triage practices. We heard testimonial from deaf people in Kenya that were beaten by the police because they didn't know about the lockdown measures. We have, in reaction to the situation, provided a lot of space for peer support and exchange among persons with disabilities and their organizations. And we have also engaged in a lot of surveys and studies to know better the situation. And what this has pointed out as well is a mental health crisis coming up with, for example, in one of our recent studies, 82% of persons with disabilities, all types of disabilities that were surveyed through this survey said they were more anxious, nervous, and worried than before the pandemic. And almost half of them have sought support for anxiety and depression. So this is really a striking figure that should also raise our attention to what would be necessary to to build back better. One thing that has been said also is the fact that the pandemic is lasting. So people with disabilities, like anyone else, have to cope with long-lasting consequences. So the socioeconomic impact is also extremely hard. People with disabilities are the first to lose their jobs. For certain groups, people with intellectual disabilities is even higher than others. There are indirect consequences of the pandemic, as we know. In Nigeria, for example, people with albinism are dying of non-COVID related health issues because simply the government has stopped supporting skin cancer treatments. So I think, yeah, there's lots of things that have been said also on the digital divide that really is disconcerting. And as everything gets shifted online, work, school, etc., our experience is that this has negative consequences in all areas of life. At the same time, it also created more opportunities to demand for accessible requirements. So captioning, I was on a panel last week with Microsoft, who said that the request for captioning in teleconferences has been multiplied by 30 just overnight. So there's hope, and I think we are at the crossroads here where we need to seize those opportunities. We don't want to go back to the old world because the old world was not inclusive, was not accessible. And one more thing that the pandemic, I think, has revealed is the key role that organizations of persons with disabilities have played as a key source of information, as peer support, as mental health support for people with disabilities and their families, those who could not access information and services. So we don't want OPDs to evolve into filling the gaps that government cannot cover for. But this has revealed that they play an essential role. And I think it's important as we speak of building back better and coming to one of the points that Dominique has made on the central role of OPDs, that they are considered essential interlocutors in co-producing tomorrow's policies and programs so that they are more inclusive. It's really critical that their voice is associated to this rebuilding. Otherwise, we will miss this opportunity and we will again have to cope with the situation with disproportionate impacts on persons with disabilities. So let me pause here and give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Priscilla. You're absolutely right. I think we, of course, we have to hope and to do our best. So let's go back to Kenya. Moses, from your part of the world, the situation with COVID and inclusive community development. You're welcome.
Thank you. I think I want to say that, first of all, persons with disability are vulnerable, because of their nature of being having disability. But during the pandemic, I think this was exacerbated more because of various reasons, because of our capacity maybe as our community, as a country. For example, the issue of access to health services was affected a great deal because, there are persons with disability who go for maybe physiotherapy services. They go to collect sunscreen lotions from health centers and all that. They go for other different services depending on their category of disability. But this was not possible, especially at the beginning of the COVID, because people did not know how to behave. Movement was curtailed and all that, physical distancing. So persons with disabilities were really affected. Again, access to education, it was difficult during the pandemic for all of us, for most children. But again, for persons with disability, it was even worse because when the others are accessing classes online, it was difficult for persons with disability because they don't have the necessary equipment to do that. Also, when it comes even to basic needs like food and some persons with disability rely on, you know, begging maybe from the streets. But now movement again was curtailed, that that fear of other people, you know, infecting persons with disability when they are giving them handouts. So it really affected even the, you know, attainment of basic needs for persons with disability. The confinement, you know, we were told to stay at home. But for persons with disabilities, it was even more difficult because if it's a pass, most of them, they like moving out, stay, you know, interacting with other people. But now we were all confined in the houses. And this brought a lot of psychological, psychosocial, and psychological challenges, anxiety that was especially brought because of a lack of information. The information that was being given by the Minister of Health was not accessible to persons with disabilities. So they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know how to behave. However, I think as many have said, this has awakened our rethinking on inclusivity, you know, programming and coming up with programs that are inclusive, so that now all implementing agencies, the national government, the county government, even the private sector, their rethinking has been reawakened, so that now there is a lot of key interest on how do we include persons with disability, an interest that was not there before. We have also seen many organizations, many individuals coming up to support persons with disabilities with offering various services that they were not offering before, or provision of even basic foods like basic needs like food and all that. You know, social protection programs like in our ministry, we had a specific program targeting persons with disability. This was not there before. The improvement of the digital, you know, accessibility also has come out very strongly, so that persons with disability are not left behind. Improving of information and communication. Again, we have seen programs, like there's one program I participated in, or that was called hygiene and the behavior change communication, where we went to 10 counties in this country, targeting persons with disabilities in the counties, so that we can communicate, we could take them tailor-made communication and messages concerning COVID-19. And it was exciting to see how most of them were not aware about masks, which appropriate masks, how to wash their hands, you know, all those. It was exciting. And it also became with the challenges, because some of the places we booked hotels, this that is what is happening. Otherwise, we have seen, you know, COVID-19 impacting both positively and negatively in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. I'm sorry for some problems with internet connection, but I am happy to be here with you one more time. I just see a very good question in our chat. Yeah. this one. Hello, I would like to ask the panel, what has your organization done and what does it offer to ensure that disabled people have opportunities to be active community development practitioners? Thanks you. This is the question from Trish. Trish, thank you very much for such important question. And it is very consistent with the next planned issue of our discussion. But first of all, can I ask our speakers to put links to your organization's websites in the chat? I think like Dominique did it because global organizations have so many projects, and I think it is possible to discuss all what everything what you are doing in this field during our discussion, but we will post these links along with video of this panel discussion and with information about speakers, so people can use this information. And as I say, we have one more next very important questions. What needs to be done to improve and further ensure the inclusion of persons with disabilities in community development going forward? Can I ask you, Dominique, to start with this question and to to stress the practical steps and to answer for question from Trish. Thank you. Please welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Anastasia. Well, maybe quickly coming back to the question you read from the chat. So where are persons with disabilities actually leading community practitioners themselves? And I would say we see this in a number of our programs. Whenever you really put organizations of persons with disabilities to the forefront and make sure they are actually driving and leading on community development. And there we have many community development practitioners who are with these organizations of persons with disabilities and persons with lived experiences of a disability. So just to address that question from the chat. Now, what are good practices that we see emerging? What is the way forward to further improve community development, to really make it inclusive? I would say there are some basic lessons learned, not only from the pandemic, but also from the time before. One is really include organizations of persons with disabilities from the beginning in your community development work. Co-create, co-design. A second one I would personally see is apply accessibility and universal design principles from the beginning in your community development programs, as this is so much more effective and efficient than to try to add it on afterwards. So really think about accessibility, universal design when you have any community development program or activity. And then always have in mind that making community development disability inclusive will ultimately benefit everyone in the community. A second example I could give you is if you really use easy to read communication, accessible communication, plain language, that will not only benefit persons with psychosocial disabilities, but it will benefit everybody, like me, for instance, who does not find it easy to understand government information, for example. So really think about it will benefit everyone in the community. So these are, I would say, basic lessons learned. Include organizations of persons with disabilities from the beginning. Make sure you apply accessibility and universal design principles from the onset. This is much more efficient and effective than thinking about it afterwards. And always have in mind this will benefit everybody. And then in more practical terms, maybe just one thing I would like to point out, which is try to make sure in your approach, in your community program, that persons with disabilities have voice, choice, and control of their own lives at all stages of your programming. And that sounds so easy to do, but it's something that very often gets forgotten in community development programs. So that is something I would like to point out as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dominic. Priscilla, thank you for sharing the links and chat with us. Can I now ask you these questions? What needs to be done to improve and further ensure the inclusion of persons with disability in community development going forward?
Thank you very much. So I won't repeat what Dominic has said. I really agree that these are essential consideration when planning to be inclusive, and I think this is extremely important at whatever project or program to ensure a meaningful role and engagement of organizations of persons with disabilities, who best than persons with disabilities themselves can confirm what works for them. But I wanted to also maybe take another perspective, which is coming back to what I was saying before, and the opportunity, if any at all, that this pandemic provides to not revert to the old world, but transform the system more sustainably. If we want community development to really make a difference for persons with disabilities, I think we need to consider what systemic changes can be made. So that, as I said before, your access to services, your opportunity to take part in your community does not depend on the goodwill of families or communities or the presence of international programs, because this is not possible for everybody. So can we think one step beyond that in terms of really building a stronger case, including globally, and IDA will play its role in that regard. For community support services, they are really a key missing link for inclusion of persons with disabilities. It often really falls through the cracks of inadequate social protection systems or community development that is not sufficiently inclusive. And often support services are not considered a human rights obligation, and it's families who are expected to provide this support. And we know that in low and middle income countries, support services for persons with disabilities are underdeveloped or they are non-existent. The pandemic also showed that they were the first type of services to be disrupted in times of crisis. So I think it's really time to invest in creating more sustainable solutions for people to access support services where they live. Not thinking community development as a patch, but mobilizing local authorities, and each at the level of their respective prerogative, to invest in creating those preconditions for participating in society and living with dignity, and having, as Dominique said, better control over their own lives. So in terms of policy, I think it requires a legal recognition of support services as an integral part of the right to live independently in the community. For this, we will need data and better knowledge of the situation, and also improving awareness raising at all levels on support services, including through tackling stigma related to disability and support. So financing will be, of course, an important element of that response, so that it's directed to proven successful community responses rather than institutional care. And again, mobilizing organizations of persons with disabilities as key stakeholders in these responses and co-producers, as I said before, of tomorrow's system. So I think this is really where I would put the focus to ensure that we move ahead away from how it was done a little bit patchy until now, to something that is embraced as a collective responsibility. As Brian said before, if there's anything positive from this crisis, is that we are living in a world that is deeply interconnected. So no one can be safe and included until all are safe and included. So let me leave it at that, to leave some more time for other panelists to contribute as well.
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you. We have one more question, practical question in our chat, and I think I can address this question to you, Moses. This is question from our keynote speaker, Anna Kamau, as I see. In normal circumstances, it's really hard for pedestrians to access public spaces in Kenya. It's even more hard for persons with disability. What options exist to close this divide? What do you think?
Thank you, Anastasia, and thank you, Anne, Kamau, for that question. I think what we have done, and I have said that it is it's a big challenge for now, but we have tried to improve inspection, especially through the National Council for Persons with Disabilities, who give inspection certificates to organizations, both private and government, as far as issues of disability mainstreaming are concerned. So those organizations that not accessible, I think they are forced in one way or another to make sure that their built-up environment, the accessibility of persons with disability is improved. However, this one is taking slow pace, I would agree. And as a department also, we are trying to engage the appropriate bodies, National Construction Authority, county government, private sector investors, to ensure that in their designing of buildings and public places, they think about persons with disability. They think about accessibility for persons with disability. So I hope that moving forward, this will improve. I can see something being done on some of the roads that we have in the roads that are coming up in Kenya, so that they are accessible or they are inclusive for persons with disability. And we hope moving forward, this will improve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Moses. Anna, what do you think about the needs to be done to improve the inclusive community development? I know that in Armenia and in Kazakhstan and other countries in our region, we have enough to tell on this point, but just a few most important points.
You know, I deeply, profoundly, and strongly believe that any change in our society, legal policies, lifestyle, anywhere, in any sphere, that gives people with disability new opportunities, chances to show their intention, their talents, to benefit the society, changes society best. Because I think the real chance of our society to be better is to do that. It's a chance for us, not for people with disability. They benefit it. And of course, the main point, I think, not only for our countries, but for any country in the world, to make stakeholders, governments, organizations, institutions, people, society understand that this works together, that this is not something divided from their life, that people with disability is not some divided part of their life. I think this is the most important job that should be done to improve that, to give people with disability seek and find that kinds of forms, beggars, that they can show this, they benefit. I think this is the most point. I have many things to say, but I think this is the most important thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. We're beginning to move towards the conclusion of our discussion. And I want to ask maybe, I think, the most important question of our discussion: which inclusive community development strategies are successfully working, and what lessons can be drawn from existing inclusive community programs for the future of inclusive community development? Priscilla, can I ask you to say us just a few words? I saw the link in the chat. I think it would be very useful for our participants, but just a few words about inclusive community development strategies.
Yeah, thank you, Anastasia. I will try to be brief, and actually, I mean, there would be so much to say on strategies that work and lessons learned. So I think as I speak, I will post one more link of a compendium of good practices that one focuses on responses to COVID-19, but I think that's a good illustration as well. I just wanted to come back on, rather than a list of what works, stressing some key principles that have been exchanged over the course of this discussion, including the central role of organizations of persons with disabilities, a rights-based approach that really challenges local authorities to act at their level of responsibility and to be held into account. And I think if there is a common point in successful solutions, is that they are often co-designed through a dialogue between local authorities, service providers, and organizations of persons with disabilities, reflecting the diversity of persons with disabilities. So another point is really to try and invest more in creating sustainable solutions for community support services. I think this is, even if I reflect on a global level where we act as IDA, there's not even a UN agency that is a host for that. You know, it's everyone, and then it's no one's responsibility to help governments develop that. So I think there's really something to do there. And looking forward, of course, we will need to address a number of barriers, the digital divide, etc. But I really wanted to stress the point made by Anna. People with disabilities are not a separate fragment of the society. And if we really want to make a dent and take this change to scale, we need to transform society's perceptions and visions of persons with disabilities. And that goes by giving them an active role, but also, changing this vision and going away from perceiving people with disabilities as objects of charity. So one of the things that we have recently done and watch out over the summer as the Paralympic Games will come up, we have signed a collaboration with the International Paralympic Committee to launch a campaign called We the 15, with a very positive message challenging those negative perceptions that will be seen by billions of people. And I think this is just one piece of the picture, but I think transforming communities everywhere, the vision is really key. Otherwise, we will revert to what we were doing before. Last and final point for me, next year you are probably aware that there will be a global disability summit hosted by Norway. This is co-hosted by IDA as well, and a government yet to be identified, and community inclusion will be one of the themes. So I think it's really a major opportunity to draw the attention of world leaders to that element. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Priscilla. It's very important information about this forum. Thank you for sharing it with us. So we have 2 minutes before the head of the conference shuts us down. Is there anything else about this that any of you would like to share, to talk about? Just 2 minutes, not more. Brian, please.
Can I make a final comment, Anastasia?
You're welcome.
Thanks. Now, just from a slightly more sort of theoretical point of view, listening to what everyone has said, I mean, I endorse all of it, you know, and this is a wonderful panel of experts on the reality of implementation of inclusive development. I just want to say from a disability studies point of view, though, that after having taught disability studies for a couple of decades, I've been convinced again and again and again that as societies, we have so much to learn from listening to people with disabilities. People with disabilities, and this is not idealizing people with disabilities at all, but it's a reality that people with disabilities have often occupied vantage points which make the reality of how our communities and our societies are shot through with inequality. I've made that really evident. People with disabilities know that. They know about adversity. They know about how social exclusion happens and how it works. And so there's an enormous amount of benefit to be had from placing people with disabilities at the center of development, because they understand what the problems are with development, what the problems are with community functioning in ways which disadvantage and exclude people, often in subtle and sometimes invisible ways. And so if we sort of interrogate and critique our communities and our societies as a whole through a prism of disability inclusiveness, if you like, thinking about everything in terms of disability inclusiveness, we go such a long way to creating societies which are generally more caring, more inclusive of everyone. And so, I mean, I've been quite inspired by learning more about this through being part of the Baseline project. And in terms of my experience as a disability scholar, it just makes so much sense. Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Yeah, Dominique?
Yeah, maybe I can build on that also in the context of this conference and the last two wonderful days and conversations we had. I mean, we talked a lot about asset-based community development, and I think it's really worthwhile to embrace inclusion of persons with disabilities, but also inclusion in the broader sense in community development as a real asset. We have so many untapped assets in the communities if we don't practice inclusion in community development. And I mean, we have a very nice claim in IACD, which is that there is no sustainable development without community development. I would like to add that there is no equitable development without inclusive community development. Thank you, Anastasia.
Definitely, Dominic. Thank you very much. Anna, just one word.
Yes, I just want to say, let's see that these words we say are very practical. And I hope that society will see it. It is not just a theory or humanistic idea. It's a practical life. And I'm very pretty sure that times are coming for everybody to see that. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to everybody.
Moses from Kenya, just few words.
All right, I want to say thank you, but also say that disability is about barriers. And if we can reduce or remove the barriers, then we can enhance the lives of persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, on behalf of International Association for Community Development, I would like to thank you, all of you, for your excellent contribution to today's discussion. I am more than sure that this will be useful for everyone involved in inclusive community development practices. We will definitely share this video on our website, on conference website, ICD's website, and our social media pages. And I just want to say that Inclusive Practices are honored to host the World Community Conference 2022 in Georgia, and we plan to have inclusion and diversity as one of the main focuses of the conference in next year. Therefore, we hope to continue our cooperation and we'll be more than happy to move forward together. Thank you very much, and see you at the Our Empowerment plenary session at 3 p.m. Nairobi time. You can find the Zoom link in the chat of the conference program. I think our tech support team will now will send it to us. And thank you very, very much, Daniel. We are late for 4 minutes. Thank you for this conference and for the opportunity to have this panel. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Anastasia. And I think the message has come through. If we are going to leave no one behind, let's co-design, let's co-create, and mainstream inclusive practices in community development. Let me welcome you to the closing session at 15 hours Nairobi time, a plenary and a closing ceremony. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and see you soon. Bye.